Jesus Freak here. It's been a pretty chaotic summer, and now we're into the beginning of the fall. I'm mostly killing time. My check comes in on Friday, and then my food stamp benefits come in the day after that. So I got some running around to do, but not today and not tomorrow. Now, I think I do pretty well given my situation. It may be because I started out with a lot and then went to having very little. And then went to having a decent bit again. And then went to having just about nothing. So I can sort of empathize with Paul when he says, you know, I've had to do without, and I've had more than enough, and I can deal with it either way. And in both situations, I'm grateful to God. Now, I have people offer to help me. And my general attitude is, you know, if you offer, I'm not really going to refuse, but I'm not really going to actively seek it out. And it's, you know, it's kind of how I was raised. So, reality has kind of hit me in the face a few times. Is, you know, the only time you're really able to go pay your rent is when you go out there and do it, and, you know, it's still within walking distance. It's just a long walk. Which I mitigate this, you know. Last couple months, I'd take a bus as far as I can go and then walk the rest of the way. That makes things a lot easier. I still have a fair bit of walking to do, but not as much. I can deal with that. It's because when other people are willing to help me out, doesn't always coincide with when I can avail myself of that help. You know, if you know, I got a couple people willing to drive me by the rental office, but there's only a small window of time when I can actually go there. And if when they're available doesn't correspond to that small window of time, that leaves me no other choice. I can deal with that. That's not a problem. I don't have an issue with it. And I've sometimes I've, you know, gone through some pretty extreme stuff, and it's been like, well, you know, I would have helped you if you asked me. I'm like, I didn't need to ask. I didn't feel there was a necessity for that. Because I feel like being self-sufficient as far as I'm able to do, which we know that's kind of limited already, is just part of being grown up. And it's not like I haven't had decades of experience. I'm not in my 20s anymore. I mean, yeah, I still live like I'm in my 20s. I still live like I'm maybe 18 or 19. I probably still look it most of the time, too. So it's like, yeah, I can understand people getting confused and thinking that I'm only about 19 or 20. I can understand that. Or I can understand, oh, I'm considered disabled legally. And this is one reason I don't like to use the word disabled, because the baggage that comes with it. People think, you got disabilities, you can't take care of. I do pretty damn well taking care of myself, considering how disabled I apparently am. And from what I can see, it's more that, other people think less of me because of certain conditions I have. I do everything I can not to let it be a disability. But I have to rely on benefits and stuff. I have to rely on that help, not because I consider myself unable to take care of myself without it, so much as no one's willing to give me the chance. And when they do, most likely I'm going to wind up worse off anyway. What I've always said is, the system's designed to trap you in the system. But it's the life I live. And I've learned to deal with it. And I'd say I deal with it pretty well, considering. Maybe it's just because I grew up in an older time with a lot less in a setting where, older was even older. When you're practically out in the middle of nowhere, the 1980s pretty much felt like the 1960s, I'm sure. And even my teachers, they were old fashioned. And maybe, they just expected more of me. My school wasn't normal to learn cursive until you were in third grade. I was taught it in second. A lot of the classes I took throughout my schooling were a year ahead of where I was expected to be. I went into what would have been my first grade year. They basically labeled me a second year of kindergarten, but I was using third grade reading books. I was using a fifth grade spelling book. I think they had me using a third grade math book. More was always expected of me. And they taught me to balance a checkbook back in fourth grade math. I mean, yeah, I only really did that up until, When I was out on my own, I barely used checks and only, kept the checkbook so much as I needed it for this or that. And I guess, I use my PayPal account like a checkbook these days, and I don't really even bother balancing it or whatever. So much as I just rely on the statements because they update in real time. The knowledge is still there. I just don't need it. Knowledge to write cursive. Still there, I don't need it. The only thing I need cursive for is to sign my name. And that's deliberately stylized. The only time I write my name in a certain format is because if they're going to check against my ID, the signature on that was taken back when I was 17. So I got to write like I wrote when I was 17. Otherwise, it's not going to match because my handwriting's gotten too jotty. Which I find funny sometimes. I do fan subs. I subtitle videos, and I sometimes, I put some fancy stylings on the lyrics of the theme songs. And I've had one of my friends sometimes say that, he thought the fonts I was using were too stylized, and he couldn't read them. It's probably because he's like 10 years younger than I am, and because I tend to use cursive fonts a lot more than he does. To me, it's like, oh, I can read this no problem. But that's the difference, they were just starting the process of phasing cursive out in the late years I was in high school. I was in middle school, they required me to use cursive for everything. I go into a special boarding school for 3 years for autistic kids, come out, I'm in 8th grade all of a sudden, and they don't require me to use cursive anymore. Needless to say, I haven't used cursive since, unless I felt like I was required to. Of course, I think part of the reason, cursive is not that big a skill anymore is because when you got one of these, you don't need to write by hand anymore. Of course, I think, you should still know. Because a lot of stuff's still written. I can read black letter and it only slows me down a little bit. I think, the oddball spellings in Jacobian English should trip me more than the black letter. You've seen me, a couple times read out of this Bible here. And, it uses long S. And I don't even trip over it. I just read it as if it's got a short S. Just the normal way that you see things written now. So just because, it's 250 years old printing, of course it's a facsimile. It's not actually from 1769. It doesn't make it any harder to read. I guess you could say, forgotten skills. Forgotten skills, forgotten experiences, and I'm always looking for experiences. Maybe that's my autism. But it helps me understand what other people talking about. When I was a kid, I had dinner a few times at a diner in front of a store called Green's. Green's was what in an older day we would have called a five and dime. There was a Woolworths in the next town over. Now, I've never been in a Woolworths. All that's left of Woolworths nowadays is Foot Locker. But Green's was basically the same thing, apparently. And, people talk about, 5 and 10's no longer a thing. Sure they are. What's Family Dollar? What's Dollar General? Apart from them not tending to have the diner in the front, and not even all 5 and 10's had those. Newberry down in Sogarty's, it was the same chain, really, same owners. And, McCrory used to be in Lewiston, and McCrory used to be in the mall. None of them had the diners in the front. But they were still 5 and 10 stores. And I'm like, when people talk about Family Dollar and Dollar General, I consider them 5 and 10. It's like, love at the 5 and dime. It's like, yeah, I can understand where they're talking about a 5 and dime. Or like, there's still a thing, drive-in movie theaters. But they're not as big a thing as they used to be. And it's like, it was almost 35 years ago. I go to this place, it's called Midway Drive-In. It's a movie theater, Minetto, New York. It's called Midway because it's located midway between Oswego and Fulton, two cities of 10 miles apart. It's on Route 48. Nice place. It's still open. They even got a Facebook page. But I haven't been there in like 30 years. But, this was back in 87. First time I think I went there. I was young and the HBO and space music still spooked the hell out of me. For some reason, they played the HBO and space music before they started the movie. So they, as is their wont, WONT want. As is their wont, they had a double feature. And this night, this weekend, the double feature was Snow White, which I don't believe ever had a theatrical release since, and Song of the South. The upshot of that is, I was one of the last people who had the chance to see Song of the South legitimately. In the US, I think. Because they've never released that movie on home video except in parts of Europe, Japan, and I think Hong Kong, although that might have been a pirate copy from a UK release. I think I actually have the Japanese DVD in my closet Nah, DVD. Laserdisc. We're talking like late 80s. It was a Laserdisc. But, yeah, I think I still have Song of the South on Laserdisc in the closet. It's a shame, really. people talk about how racist Song of the South is. Song of the South was pretty progressive for its time. 1946. They were doing, African American folklore, and they had an African American doing the telling. And, they weren't doing blackface or anything. They were trying to be, they were trying to be legitimate about it. Same idea, I guess, when they eventually did Mulan. And had, a lot of the roles were actually filled by actual Asian and, Asian Americans, but, ethnic Asians. Most, ethnic Chinese. And even some of the roles weren't Chinese people doing the voices. They were still Asian. So they were trying. There's a page on TV tropes, Fairford State. We might consider it problematic now, but it was ahead of its time. But that was the last time it was in movie theaters, Song of the South, so I'm glad I was able to see it then. Do I remember anything from then? No. Well, yeah, I remember like bits and pieces of very faded memories. Which I topped up, watching the Snow White later and Song of South clips later. Because memory is a finicky thing. But I'm grateful for what I've experienced. Anyway, I've been rambling, so cut this off. Jesus, freak out.